Hi everyone, my name's Zach Barber and welcome to my philosophy lecture series for Philosophy 101, so that's an introduction to philosophy. Really excited to be here today, and for the first lesson we're going to be talking about one of the classic philosophical problems. Problem has a long history, but we're not going to worry about that. I want to just focus on the problem itself to give you a sense of the problem. And I want to start to give you a sense of what philosophy is all about. So investigating this problem should begin illuminating the nature of philosophy, which we'll cover in the next lesson. So the problem is the problem of skepticism. Now, the problem comes in a lot of varieties, but what they all have in common is the idea that a large swath of human knowledge really isn't knowledge at all. So, what they have in common is the assertion that many things we ordinarily take ourselves to know, we don't know. So just to get a little bit more precise about things, here's a crude definition of the kinds of theses we're going to be discussing today. So philosophical skepticism is any of a variety of philosophical theses that hold that we do not know much of what we ordinarily assume ourselves to know. So here are some examples. Ordinarily, we assume that we live in a world with stable, enduring, external physical objects, like chairs, tables, guitars, banjos, people. Skepticism, or one version of it, would deny that we know that those sorts of things exist. Here's another example. The world tomorrow will in many ways be like the world today. The sun will rise tomorrow. People will exist tomorrow. Those are the sorts of things I'm talking about here. And again, skepticism would deny that we know them. Finally, we often assume that other people have minds. That is to say, there are minds other than our own in the universe, right? So we know that we feel pain because we directly perceive it, but we assume that other people feel pain too. We assume that other people feel happiness and pleasure. But one version of skepticism would deny that there are other minds, or at least that we know that there are other minds in the universe. So how might we establish one of these absurd views? That is, how might we arrive at such a crazy conclusion? I'll start with a basic question. Have you ever wondered whether you were in the Matrix? In this deeply philosophical movie from 1999, there's people who are hooked up to some sort of AI interface, a giant computer, right? Where they believe that they are walking along the street or going to their jobs, living their normal lives. But really what's going on is this is a computer simulation making them have those kinds of experiences. In fact, they're sitting in some vat of liquid hooked up to this giant computer. Sorry, that was my cat Mino. He might make an appearance from time to time here in the mini lecture series. Incidentally, his name comes from a famous philosophical dialogue by Plato. So anyway, for the individuals who are still hooked up to the matrix, that is, the ones who are still plugged in to the computer interface, all of their experiences of what they think is the world and what they think is their daily life, they're completely mistaken. They don't represent reality. Have you ever wondered whether that was currently happening to you? Because of course, you could be hooked up to some computer that is giving you the experience of watching this philosophy mini lecture. It could give you the experience of eating your favorite meal, walking down the street, doing pretty much anything you do in your everyday life. Interesting. Here's an alternative scenario. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? You could be having a dream with these very contents, right? You could be dreaming about pretty much any experience you've ever had, right? So, given these possibilities, how can we be sure that any of the experiences we're currently having or the experiences we've had in the past are real? Many philosophers, or at least some philosophers, take these possibilities, right, the fact that these possibilities could happen, to indicate a fundamental sort of threat to our knowledge of the external world, our knowledge of many, many things, almost our knowledge of everything. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, those are philosophers. I'm just a normal person. I don't really care that much about this. These are absurd scenarios. Sure, they're fun in Hollywood films like The Matrix. Yeah, it's, fine if you want to sit around, talk with your friends about maybe we're all dreaming right now. Whatever, Zach. We can think about these things, but dismiss them because they're pretty crazy and absurd. Well, I agree with you that they're pretty crazy, but I'm here to argue today, in our first mini lecture, that they're actually really hard to dismiss. That is, it's really, really hard to undermine or reject, at least in a rational way, the conclusions of various skeptical arguments that invoke these sorts of scenarios. It's ridiculously hard, in fact, and I'm going to run through a series of arguments for various skeptical conclusions in this first mini lecture. And I really hope to demonstrate how powerful some of these arguments are and how difficult it is to refute them. So all that's to say, it's really, really easy to come to a skeptical conclusion or to establish one. And so we can't so easily dismiss it as we really do pretty much every day of normal, non-philosophical life. Okay, so let's get to the arguments. Okay, so let's start by reeling things back a little bit. Instead of considering the really global skeptical scenarios that are raised by possibilities like being in the matrix or dreaming, let's think about something a bit more modest. So this is the problem of skepticism that results from peer disagreement. So I want you to first think of your most strongly held political view. Let's say it's about abortion. Let's say it's about which political party is superior in some way to the other. It could be about drug laws. It could be about any political topic that you feel strongly about. Next step. I want to bet that for any view you hold, or almost any view you hold, someone who is equally as smart as you, someone who has considered the evidence equally as thoroughly as you, someone who has an equal amount of bias as you, holds the exactly opposite view. Now, if that's right, that seems to really undermine any justification, really, or any sort of foundation that we have to rest on for the original political view, right? And we could even ramp up things a little bit here. I'll bet you that for any political view you hold, there's somebody out there who's smarter than you, somebody who's considered the evidence more thoroughly than you. They might even be an expert on this topic, or if not an expert, somebody who's really read a lot about it. They might even be less biased than you, more impartial, reading evidence and arguments on both sides of this issue. And let's say they've even thought about this issue just for a lot longer than you have. And they, having all of these properties, come to the opposite view as you. Now, what should we believe given these very, very likely facts? It seems that you shouldn't believe your original political view. You have no good reason to believe that you happen to get things right and your opponent didn't. And especially in the ramped up case, where this person is, sort of better than you in every way at forming beliefs rationally, they believe the opposite. So this sort of skepticism doesn't threaten every kind of knowledge, doesn't undermine the justification for any kind of belief, but it does undermine the justification that we have for a great deal of our cherished beliefs, right? I mean, a lot of our beliefs about morality, a lot of our beliefs about politics, a lot of our beliefs about religion, they're threatened by disagreement from peers. For instance, here are two extremely intelligent and well-read individuals who disagree about the existence of God.
Here's how religion has this effect, in my opinion. It is derived from the childhood of our species, from the bawling, fearful period of infancy. It comes from the time when we did not know that we lived on an orb. We thought we lived on a disc. When we did not know that we went round the sun, or that the sky was not a dome. When we didn't know that there was a germ theory to explain disease and innumerable theories for the explanation of things like famine. It comes from a time when we had no good answers, but because we are pattern-seeking animals, a good thing about us, and because we will prefer even a conspiracy theory or a junk theory to no theory at all, a bad thing about us, this is and was our first attempt at philosophy, just as in some ways it was our first attempt at science. And it was all founded on, and remains founded on, a complete misapprehension about the origins, first of the universe, and second, about human nature. We now know a great deal about the origins of the universe, and a great deal about our own nature.
Number one, then, why anything at all exists. This is the deepest question of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? This mystery, which according to Aristotle lay at the very root of philosophy, is one which even thoughtful naturalists cannot avoid. Now, experience teaches that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This principle seems quite plausible, at least more so than it's contradictory. Now, it's obvious that the universe exists. It therefore follows logically that the universe has an explanation of its existence. So, what sort of explanation could the universe have? Well, it seems plausible that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external, transcendent, personal cause. Why? Because the cause of the universe must be greater than the universe. Think of the universe, all of space and time. So the cause of the universe must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. And therefore, it follows that the explanation of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause. That is to say, there exists an unembodied mind which created the universe, which is what most people have traditionally meant by the word God.
So, as I said, we see this sort of phenomenon all over the place. People who are equally qualified on a given issue disagree about what should be done about that issue. This is a troubling sort of skepticism. Our political discourse isn't really sensitive to it. Our political behavior isn't really sensitive to it. People often go about on all sides of an issue as if they're 100% certain that they're correct. So at this point, I invite you to pause the video and see if you can find anything wrong with this argument. Is there any solid way of objecting to this sort of skeptical conclusion? Here's another really famous one, and it'll be our second major skeptical argument that we consider in today's mini lecture. So this is known as Hume's problem of induction, or just the problem of induction in philosophy. It comes, of course, from the famous philosopher David Hume. So this seems to be an obvious fact. I know the sun will rise tomorrow. That is, it seems to be clearly true that the sun will rise tomorrow. I'm justified in believing this to be true. That's a sort of inductive prediction about the future. When we are assuming that the sun will rise tomorrow, what we're doing is we're extrapolating based on our past experience into the future. We're saying that a certain pattern will hold in the future that we've observed to hold in the past. This is the process of induction. It's a sort of reasoning process by which we make predictions about unobserved cases. We generalize from the observed cases. Here's an example that comes from Richard Feldman in his textbook Epistemology. There's a fall gardener who plants flowers in the fall, anticipating that they will start growing in the spring and throughout the summer. Every year, this gardener observes that 80% of the bulbs planted actually grow into flowers in the spring. And so the gardener makes the generalization that 80% of his current project will make its way to the next spring. But let's go back to the case of the sun and whether it will rise tomorrow. I've put up a crude argument for Hume's problem of induction on this slide. So let's look at that. First premise, if I know the sun will rise tomorrow, then I must have reason to believe the unobserved cases, that is, cases in the future like tomorrow, will resemble observed cases of the past, like yesterday. So that seems to be a completely innocent premise. It just seems to be asserting that if I know something to be true, I've got to have reason to believe it's true. I've got to have some support for my knowledge. That seems to be totally right and safe and really immune from any objections. Now let's look at premise 2. It says, I have no reason to believe the unobserved cases will resemble the observed cases. Now here's where things seem to get counterintuitive. You might think, of course I have reason to believe the sun will rise tomorrow, or to believe that the unobserved cases will resemble the observed cases. I've already observed all these cases and they conform to a certain pattern. So why not think that the others will also conform to this pattern? Right? Here's the problem with making that assumption. One, it can't be logically assumed, or it can't be assumed in an a priori way. Because, of course, things could turn out differently, right? There's no logical guarantee that the gardener's bulbs will bloom in 80% frequency next spring. There's no guarantee that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? The Earth could spin off into a new trajectory due to an asteroid strike, and that would prevent the sun from rising, right? Or could, at least. So there's no logical or a priori, as philosophers would say, sort of guarantee that the unobserved cases will resemble the observed cases. Moreover, it seems that if we appeal to anything else other than logic, right, and a priori reasoning, it seems that we have to assume the truth of the very principle that is in question, right? So I say here, we may have past experience that supports the idea that the unobserved will resemble the observed. But we can't rely on that because that's the very thing at issue here, right? We're wondering whether the unobserved cases will resemble the observed cases. But they might not. And we can't assume that they will when we're wondering whether they will. If we relied on the uniformity of observation to justify the uniformity of other observations, we'd be arguing in a circular way, arguing in a circle. So, therefore, the conclusion of this argument is, I do not know the sun will rise tomorrow. Whoa, mama. A big, big form of skepticism reached here, right? A lot of things that we assume ourselves to know are based on induction. For instance, all of science, pretty much all of science, is based on inductive reasoning. We look at some observed cases and we generalize from those. We look at what patterns held in the past, and we generalize and predict that they will hold in the future. We look at certain things in one part of space, like gravity, and we assume that those things hold or obtain in other parts of space. But this argument seems to undercut that very process of reasoning. Therefore, we are left without any knowledge of science. It also undercuts basic assumptions that we make every day. Here's another example from Feldman. We assume that when we sit down in a chair, it won't eject us. It will be a comfortable place to sit. According to this argument, that assumption that the chair is safe to sit in is mistaken. So I hope that you get some of the sort of feel of this, of the breadth of this sort of argument. It's extraordinarily sweeping, and it's extraordinarily troubling. I invite you again to pause the video at this point to see if you can think of ways to object to the argument. I hope at this point you're realizing how easy it is to arrive at a skeptical conclusion and how difficult it is to resist. But if not, that's okay, because I still have one more to throw at you, and this is what started the whole lecture. These are the arguments for a global form of skepticism, a form of skepticism that isn't limited to inductive knowledge or knowledge about morality and politics and religion. This form of skepticism denies that we know anything about the world outside of our own minds. So we might be familiar with our sense data, right? Our immediate experiences. We might know what their contents are. But according to this argument, we can't assume that anything real lies behind those sensory experiences. That is, we can't assume that there is an external world. Okay, so according to common sense, basic assumption is there is a world of enduring and relatively stable physical objects. We assume that my experiences or our experiences are typically caused by those objects stimulating my sense organs, right? So light bounces off the table or the banjo and it hits my eyes, so I see a table or a banjo. I pluck the string on the banjo and the vibrations in the air cause my eardrum to vibrate and I hear a certain note or a beautiful bluegrass melody. But here are some alternative hypotheses, alternative explanations for what's going on in these sorts of cases, right? And I should say that these cases and this particular argument, again, come from Richard Feldman's textbook on epistemology, particularly around page 142 in that text. I am a brain in a vat, connected to a powerful computer. This is the matrix scenario. The computer stimulates my brain, giving me sensory experiences of the table or of the banjo, of the beautiful bluegrass melody. The computer has been programmed to make my experiences regular and orderly, to make it seem like there's an external world outside of my mind. Okay, here's another alternative hypothesis to explain my experiences. All of those experiences are the result of a dream. My dreams are usually relatively systematic and orderly, so they might make me think that I'm in an external world with stable, enduring objects. But in fact, that's just how my dream is. And finally, this is a skeptical hypothesis that comes from René Descartes, a towering figure in philosophy. He hypothesized that all of these experiences could be caused by an evil genius that causes me to have these regular and orderly experiences in order to trick me into believing the common sense hypothesis. So this evil genius may have some magical powers that stimulate my brain or my mind into having the experiences that I currently do. Okay, so with these hypotheses on the table, we can now make the argument. Let's look at it. Premise 1. The evidence people have from their experience of the world does not provide better reason to believe ordinary external world propositions and common sense than to believe the rival skeptical hypotheses, such as the dreaming hypothesis, the brain in a vat hypothesis, and the evil genius hypothesis. Right? So it just seems that we have equal evidence for all of these hypotheses. The evidence doesn't favor any one over any of the others. That seems to be a pretty safe premise, right? Because in all of these scenarios, we would be experiencing exactly the same thing, right? That is, even in the common sense scenario, we would be experiencing exactly the same thing as in all of the other skeptical scenarios. Okay, so again, pretty strong premise there. Hard to object. Premise 2. If one's evidence does not provide better reason to believe one hypothesis than to believe some rival hypothesis, then one is not justified in believing that hypothesis, right? If evidence favors no one hypothesis over the others, then we can't favor that hypothesis over the others, right? So we can't favor the common sense hypothesis over the others because it's no better supported, right? any favoring would be irrational, right? Really, we should be completely agnostic as to which of these hypotheses is true. Again, that seems like a really solid premise, right? We can't believe things unless we have best evidence to believe them, right? The evidence favors no one of these over the others, so we can't believe them. Finally, conclusion, people are not justified in believing and thus do not know ordinary external world propositions and common sense. Because of these possibilities, these alternative hypotheses, we cannot know the basic common sense assumptions or beliefs about the external world. So we don't know really anything is true outside of our own immediate experience and our minds. Whoa, I really hope you feel the power of this argument. At least for me, it's deeply unnerving. Pause the video. Think about it. Let it sink in. Let it get under your skin. I really hope that this argument makes you a little bit uncomfortable, because if it does, then you're really understanding it. I also invite you to pause the video to think of how you might resist this argument, how we could object to the conclusion or the premises laid out here. Okay, so finally I'm going to leave you with some questions to think about. Questions that should foster discussion between you and your philosophical friends. And questions that I want you to really think about before class if you are taking a class with me. You should be prepared to answer these in class time. So, first question, does the threat of skepticism bother you on an emotional level? Why or why not? I've been sort of emphasizing that, especially at the end. Thinking about what's going on here. And really, I do believe that there should be some discomfort here. Obviously, I don't want to disturb you or anything. But, these sorts of possibilities are worrisome. And I think that those sorts of worries indicate understanding. So, I don't know, I just want you to think about what's going on here. And maybe feel it on an emotional level. I think very often those sorts of emotions can deepen our inquiry. They can fuel thoughts and objections and implications. They sort of motivate the mind to really engage with these problems deeply and passionately. And I really want to try to foster that for you in this course. Second, more intellectual question, can you think of other kinds of skepticism and arguments that support them? Try writing them out in premise-conclusion format. So that is with the numbers like I was writing them out in the slides here. And I should say that we will talk much more about arguments and premise-conclusion format and logic in a later mini-lecture in this course. Arguments play a major role in philosophy, so we'll be dealing with those far more thoroughly than I do here. So if you're not totally following some of the vocabulary I use to describe arguments here, don't worry, we're going to talk about that later in the course. And that concludes today's lesson. In our next lesson, we'll be talking about what philosophy is in the first place. And we'll use some of the things we discussed today to illuminate the nature of philosophy and think about what it is that philosophers are doing when they do philosophy. So I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks, everybody.